The first snow had fallen 3 nights before the bridge closed. Maxim remembered it because his daughter Anya had pressed her small hands against the frosted glass of their apartment window, her breath fogging the pain as she whispered something about angels. He had smiled then, pulled her close, and told her they would leave soon, that the war wouldn't reach them if they moved fast enough. But wars don't wait for fathers to keep their promises. They move like shadow across sunlight, sudden and absolute, swallowing everything soft. Now the bridge stretched before them like a question no one wanted to answer. The morning of departure. The convoy had started with 12 vehicles. By dawn, only 7 remained. The others had turned back at the last checkpoint. Drivers pale-faced and silent, their eyes carrying the weight of rumors no one dared speak aloud. Maxim's wife Darina sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers white at the knuckles. She hadn't spoken since they'd passed the burnt-out school on the edge of Bucha. Anya slept in the back seat, her small body curled against their border collie, Hrom, Thunder, a name that had once seemed playful, but now felt prophetic. The dog hadn't slept at all. Maxim had noticed it hours ago, the way Hrom's ears twitched at sounds that didn't exist, the low rumble in his chest that never quite became a growl. The animal's amber eyes tracked movement through the window, shadows cast by nothing, shifts in light that made no sense. Darina had suggested they leave the dog behind. Her voice had been gentle, practical, but Anya had cried and Maxim had seen something in Hrom's gaze that felt too human to ignore. So the dog came with them, and now as they approached the bridge, Hrom began to shake. The bridge itself was a Soviet relic, built in the 1970s when concrete and steel were symbols of permanence rather than decay. 2 lanes wide, suspended over the Irpin River, it connected the suburb where they'd lived their entire lives to the highway that led west, toward Poland, toward safety, toward a future that still existed somewhere beyond the smoke. The water below moved slowly, thick with silt and the reflection of a sky that couldn't decide between grey and white. There were no soldiers guarding the bridge. That should have been the first warning. The line that didn't move. The convoy slowed to a crawl. Ahead, vehicles bunched together like cattle sensing a storm, brake lights flaring red in the dim morning light. Maxim leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to see past the truck in front of them. The driver, a man in his 60s with a wool cap pulled low, had stopped completely. His hazard lights blinked in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Why aren't we moving?" Darina's voice was barely a whisper. Maxim didn't answer because he didn't know. Through the windshield, he could see figures stepping out of their cars, standing in the middle of the road, gesturing at one another with the frantic energy of people who'd just realized they were lost. A woman in a green coat walked toward the bridge, stopped at its threshold, then backed away as if she'd touched something hot. Hrom's shaking intensified. His claws scraped against the back seat upholstery. Anya stirred, her small hand reaching out to rest on the dog's neck. "Papa, why is Hrom scared?" "He's not scared, Malyash, he's just—" Maxim stopped, the lie wouldn't form. Hrom was scared, and worse, the dog's fear felt contagious, spreading through the car like cold air through a cracked window. Maxim unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the morning chill. The wind carried the scent of burning rubber and something else, something sweet and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. He approached the truck ahead of them, nodding to the old man who stood beside it, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "So what's happening? Why did we stop?" The man took a long drag, exhaled slowly and pointed toward the bridge with the glowing tip of his cigarette. "They say it's mined." Maxim's blood turned to ice. "Who says?" "Everyone, no one. Does it matter?" The man's laugh was bitter, empty. "Someone walked halfway across an hour ago, turned back, said the surface looked disturbed. Like someone had dug and covered it again." He flicked ash onto the ground. "Could be true, could be panic. But are you willing to bet your family's life on which?" Maxim looked toward the bridge. From where he stood, it appeared solid, unremarkable, just old concrete and rusted railings, the same structure he'd driven across 100 times before the war. But now it seemed different, transformed by rumor into something sinister. He could see the woman in the green coat standing at its edge, crouched low, running her fingers across the pavement as if reading Braille. When he returned to the car, Darina was already staring at him, her question written in the tight line of her mouth. "They think it's mined," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice steady for Anya's sake. Darina closed her eyes. For 3 long seconds she didn't breathe. Then, "What do we do?" Behind them a horn blared, someone further back in the convoy, someone who hadn't heard the rumor yet, someone still naive enough to believe that forward motion equaled progress. The sound was sharp, angry, obscene in the heavy silence that had settled over the bridge. Hrom barked, not his usual bark, the playful sound he made when Anya threw his ball, but something raw and desperate, a sound that belonged to a creature in pain. The feeling of being watched Maxim made the decision the way most decisions were made in wartime. Quickly, with incomplete information, and the queasy certainty that every option carried a cost too high to calculate. They would cross, slowly, carefully. They would follow the tracks of the vehicle ahead. If anyone had already made it across safely, then the path was likely clear. It wasn't logic, it was hope dressed in the clothes of reason. He pulled the car forward, inching toward the bridge's entrance. Other drivers watched, their faces pale and drawn, waiting to see what would happen. Maxim felt their eyes on him, felt the terrible weight of being first, of becoming either a hero or a cautionary tale. Darina reached over and placed her hand on his knee. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The front tires touched the bridge's surface. The concrete groaned. A sound that might have been normal, structural, the complaint of old materials bearing weight. But in that moment, it sounded like a warning. Hrom lunged forward, his body slamming into the space between the front seats. His teeth bared, not in aggression, but in something more primal. Fear, yes, but also urgency, the desperate need to communicate something he couldn't put into words. The dog's entire body vibrated with tension. "Hromny, sit!" Maxim's command came out harsher than he intended. The dog didn't sit. Instead, Hrom twisted, his paws scraping against Anya's legs as he tried to climb over her, tried to reach the door. Anya yelped, not in pain but in surprise, and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, pulling him back. "Papa, he wants to get out." "He can't get out, not here, not now." But even as Maxim said it, he felt doubt creeping in. Hrom wasn't acting like a frightened animal. He was acting like a creature who knew something, who'd sensed a truth hidden from human perception. Dogs could smell cancer, could predict seizures, could detect shifts in air pressure before storms. What could they sense about death? The car moved forward, tires humming against the bridge's surface. 10 meters. 20. The river below reflected nothing, its surface dark and opaque, like a mirror turned away from the sky. And then Hrom stopped struggling. The sudden stillness was worse than the panic. The dog froze, every muscle locked, his amber eyes fixed on something ahead, something Maxim couldn't see. Hrom's lips pulled back from his teeth, and a sound emerged from deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a whine, but something between the two, something that sounded horribly like grief. Maxim's foot hovered over the brake pedal, his heart hammered against his ribs. Behind them, another car had started onto the bridge, emboldened by their progress. The pressure to continue was immense. To stop now would trap them, would create a bottleneck, would draw attention they couldn't afford. "Maxim!" Darina's voice was steady, but he heard the tremor beneath it. "Something's wrong." He knew. God help him, he knew. Every instinct screamed at him to reverse, to turn back, to find another route even if it took days. But Anya was in the back seat, and the fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and the radio that morning had warned that the eastern routes were already cut off. So he pressed the accelerator gently, and the car rolled forward. That was when Hrom threw himself against the door with such force that the entire vehicle rocked. The impact came from within, not an explosion, not a collision, but the desperate violence of a living creature that had decided obedience was less important than survival. Hrom's body slammed against the rear passenger door with such force that Anya screamed, her small hands losing their grip on his collar. The dog's claws found purchase on the window's edge, scrabbling, tearing at the rubber seal, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts that fogged the glass. Maxim's foot hit the brake instinctively. The car lurched to a stop. For a moment everything froze, the family suspended in a tableau of confusion and mounting terror, the bridge stretching ahead and behind them like a trap, closing in slow motion. Through the rearview mirror, Maxim could see the car behind them, its driver leaning forward, horn blaring again, arms gesturing wildly. "Move! Keep moving, don't stop." But Hrom was beyond hearing, beyond commands, beyond anything except the primal imperative screaming through his nervous system. The dog's amber eyes fixed on Maxim's reflection in the mirror. For 3 heartbeats, human and animal stared at each other, and Maxim felt something pass between them. Not understanding exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that fear this pure, this absolute, couldn't be faked or misunderstood. Darina's voice cut through the moment, sharp with the kind of forced calm that only comes from keeping hysteria at arm's length. Let him out. What? Let him out. She turned in her seat, reaching back to cradle Anya's face in her hands, blocking the child's view of the trembling dog. He's trying to tell us something, and we're not listening. Maxim's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every fiber of logic told him this was insane. Opening the door would mean losing the dog, would mean Anya's inevitable tears, would mean one more loss in a war already defined by subtraction. But beneath the logic, in that deeper place where instinct lived, he knew Darina was right. He reached back and pulled the door handle. Hrom exploded from the car like a bullet from a chamber, his paws hitting the bridge's surface in a scramble of motion and desperation. But he didn't run away. He didn't bolt toward the far end of the bridge or retreat to the side they'd come from. Instead, he ran ahead, 30 meters, 40, and then stopped dead, his body rigid, his head lowered toward the concrete, and began to dig. The thing beneath his claws tore at the bridge's surface with a sound like chalk on slate, high and terrible, scraping away at nothing visible, at empty pavement that looked no different from any other section of road. The other drivers had stopped now, too. Maxim could see them emerging from their vehicles, drawn by the spectacle. A dog gone mad, a family paralyzed, the entire convoy brought to a standstill by an animal's inexplicable behavior. Maxim stepped out of the car. The cold hit him immediately, sharp enough to make his eyes water. He moved forward slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the bridge itself were resisting his approach. Behind him, he heard Darina telling Anya to stay in the car, to keep the door locked, to not watch whatever was about to happen. But Anya was already watching. They all were. Hrom's digging had exposed something, not the concrete they expected, but a seam, a line where the surface had been disturbed and poorly concealed. The color was wrong, the texture off, like a scar on skin that hadn't healed properly. Maxim knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on Hrom's heaving flank, feeling the rapid hammering of the animal's heart through fur and muscle. "Easy, boy, easy." The dog ignored him, teeth now joining claws, biting at the edges of the disturbed concrete, pulling away chunks no bigger than pebbles but revealing more of the seam beneath. And then Maxim saw it, a flash of color that didn't belong, red and blue plastic wire. His blood turned to ice water. "Bojami," he whispered. My God. He stood so fast he nearly fell, backpedaling from the spot, hands raised as if the gesture could somehow undo what he'd seen. Around him, the other drivers had gone silent, their faces registering the shift from annoyance to comprehension, to pure animal terror. The woman in the green coat spoke first, her voice carrying across the bridge with crystalline clarity. "It's a mine, an improvised mine. Panic doesn't move through crowds like a wave, it moves like lightning, instantaneous and total." Someone screamed. An engine roared to life. The truck behind Maxim's car began to reverse, its driver no longer caring about coordination or safety, driven only by the need to put distance between himself and the thing beneath the road. But Maxim couldn't move. His legs had stopped obeying, rooted to the bridge by the terrible knowledge that if Hrom hadn't stopped them, if they'd driven another 30 meters at their previous speed, the weight of their car would have triggered the device. Anya would be dead. Darina would be dead, he would be dead, reduced to metal and memory and the kind of tragedy that becomes a statistic in someone else's war. Hrom sat beside the exposed seam, panting, his tongue lolling from his mouth, his tail making a single weak wag. The man who knew a figure approached from the far end of the bridge, a man walking with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes from extensive training or profound shock. He wore civilian clothes, but the way he moved suggested military background. Shoulders back, eyes scanning, every step placed with precision. As he drew closer, Maxim could see he was older, maybe 50, with grey stubble and deep-set eyes that carried the weight of too many things seen and not forgotten. The man stopped 3 meters from the exposed device and crouched, studying it without touching, his expression neutral in a way that felt more frightening than panic would have been. "IED," he said finally, voice flat. "Pressure-triggered, amateur construction, but effective enough. If your vehicle had hit it—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maxim found his voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. "How do you know? How can you tell?" The man glanced at him, and something like sympathy flickered across his face. "I worked EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. 14 years in the Army, 6 deployments." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. I retired 3 years ago. Thought I was done with this shit. A bitter laugh. Turns out this shit isn't done with me. Can you disarm it? No. The word was absolute. I don't have tools. No robot, no protective suit, no X-ray to see what we're dealing with. For all I know, there's an anti-tamper switch. Touching it could set it off. He looked back toward the convoy, toward the faces pressed against car windows, the children being held by terrified parents. We need to mark this position, clear the bridge and call it in. Military engineers can deal with it properly. But we can't cross. No, the man agreed. You can't cross here. A woman's voice, sharp with desperation. Then where? There are no other bridges. The northern route is cut off. The eastern roads are under bombardment. This was the last way out. The former EOD specialist said nothing because there was nothing to say. The silence that followed was the sound of hope dying, of futures closing, of families realizing they were trapped between a war they couldn't outrun and a bridge they couldn't cross. Hrom padded back to Maxim and pressed his body against his owner's legs. The dog's shaking had stopped. His breathing had slowed. He looked up at Maxim with those amber eyes, and in them, Maxim saw something that felt too much like understanding. He saved us. Darina had appeared beside him. Anya clutched against her chest. Her voice was barely a whisper. He saved all of us. The former soldier heard her. He looked at Hrom for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Dogs can smell explosives, the chemical signature. It's how we trained them in the service. They can detect compounds invisible to human senses. He knelt, extending a hand toward Hrom, letting the dog sniff his fingers. This one's got a good nose. And strong instincts. Most pets would have been too distracted or too scared, but this one... Thunder, Maxim said. His name is Hrom, Thunder. Thunder, the man repeated and allowed himself a small smile. Fitting, because what he just did was loud enough to wake everyone up. The second device. But Thunder wasn't done. As the convoy began the slow, agonizing process of reversing off the bridge, a maneuver requiring coordination and calm that few possessed in their current state, Hrom's head lifted. His ears swiveled forward. That low sound began in his chest again, the one that lived somewhere between growl and whine, the one that meant something was wrong. Maxim felt his stomach drop. No, not again. But the dog was already moving, trotting along the shoulder of the bridge, nose low to the ground, tracking something. The former EOD specialist watched, his expression shifting from calm to alert, to something that looked like dread. "Stop the vehicles!" he called out. "Nobody move!" Hrom stopped again, 40 meters from the first device, closer to the bridge's western end. He pawed at the ground, more gently this time, as if he'd learned from the first discovery that urgency didn't require violence. The man walked over, moving with the exaggerated caution of someone crossing ice they knew was cracked. He examined the area where Hrom had stopped, then closed his eyes and swore softly in Ukrainian, a long string of words that needed no translation. "What is it?" Maxim called from his position beside his car. The man looked up, his face pale. "It's a second device. They mined both ends." He stood, turning to face the trapped convoy, his voice carrying in the cold air. "They wanted to box you in. If you'd made it past the first, you'd have hit the second. If you'd tried to reverse after spotting one, you'd have backed into the other. It's a kill corridor." The weight of understanding settled over the convoy like ash. They were trapped on the bridge. Behind them, mines. Ahead, mines. Below, a river too cold to survive. Above, a sky that offered no rescue. Someone began to cry. Maxim heard it, a sound small and broken coming from one of the other vehicles. Then another voice joined it, and another, until the bridge echoed with the sound of collective despair. But Hrom stood silent, tail wagging slowly, looking at Maxim with an expression that seemed to say, "I did my job, now you do yours." And in that moment, Maxim realized the dog hadn't just saved them from the mines, he'd saved them from ignorance, from the deadly assumption that the bridge was safe, that escape was simple, that war followed rules that made sense. Hrom had forced them to stop, to look, to see the trap for what it was. The question was, now what? Lieutenant Sofia Marchenko hadn't been assigned to this sector. She'd come because she couldn't sleep, because the dreams wouldn't let her, because 3 days earlier she'd listened to a radio intercept that mentioned civilian corridors and strategic denial in the same sentence, and those words had lodged in her brain like shrapnel. Now she stood at the eastern checkpoint, binoculars raised, watching the cluster of vehicles stranded mid-bridge like insects caught in amber. "They're not moving," said the soldier beside her, a corporal barely 20 years old whose name she kept forgetting because new faces arrived and disappeared too quickly to matter. "They can't move," Sophia corrected, adjusting the focus. Through the lenses she could see figures standing on the bridge, a dog circling, the unmistakable body language of people confronting something they couldn't understand. "Something's wrong." The corporal shrugged. "Probably ran out of fuel or got scared. Civilians panic." Sophia lowered the binoculars and looked at him with the kind of cold assessment that made young soldiers uncomfortable. Civilians don't panic by stopping in the middle of a bridge during an evacuation. They panic by speeding up, by pushing forward, by moving until the tank is empty or the road ends. She raised the binoculars again. This is something else. She'd seen enough evacuations to know the patterns, the desperate momentum, the way fear drove people forward, even when forward meant driving into danger. For an entire convoy to stop mid-crossing suggested either mechanical failure or her blood ran cold. "Get me the engineers, now." "Ma'am?" "Now, Corporal. And find out if anyone's reported suspicious activity near that bridge in the last 48 hours. Locals, military, anyone." As the young soldier scrambled to obey, Sophia kept her binoculars trained on the scene. She watched the dog, a dark shape moving with purpose, not panic. She watched a man kneeling beside something on the ground. She watched the body language shift from confusion to horror. And she knew someone had mined the bridge. The saboteur's logic. Military engineers arrived 20 minutes later, a two-vehicle team carrying equipment that looked simultaneously sophisticated and improvised, the hallmark of a military stretched too thin across too many fronts. The senior engineer, a captain named Lysenko, listened to Sophia's assessment with an expression that never changed, then nodded once. "Makes sense," he said, voice flat. "The bridge is a choke point. Take it out, you trap everyone on the eastern side. But if you just blow it normally, satellite imaging catches it immediately, and command knows the route is cut. But if you mine it and wait for civilian weight to trigger it?" He gestured toward the stranded convoy. "You get your obstruction, and you create a disaster that chews up rescue resources, clogs communication channels, dominates the news cycle." Sophia felt sick. So this was planned, deliberate. Warfare 101, Lieutenant. Deny the enemy mobility. Inflict maximum psychological damage. Make people afraid to use any route, any bridge, any road. Lysenko began unpacking equipment. Cables, a small robot, detection gear. The question is, who planted them? Our side would have logged it. Their side wouldn't have had access, which means saboteurs, Sophia finished. Someone local, someone with access. The implications hung between them, ugly and undeniable. Wars created traitors, the way rain created mud. Not through malice necessarily, but through the erosion of certainty, the wearing away of loyalty by fear, coercion, or simple desperation. "Can you clear it?" she asked. Lysenko's laugh was short and bitter. "Eventually, if we had 6 hours, proper equipment, and air support to make sure no one takes shots at us while we work." He looked toward the bridge, then back at Sophia. "But we don't have 6 hours. Enemy artillery is adjusting fire patterns every 2 hours, and this sector is on the edge of their current range. If they realize there's a cluster of civilians trapped on that bridge..." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what artillery did to static targets. Sophia raised the binoculars again. Through the magnification, she could see a child's face pressed against a car window. Small, dark-haired, maybe 8 years old, the same age her niece had been before. She lowered the binoculars and made a decision. "I'm going out there." "That's insane." "Probably, but those people need to know help is coming. They need to know they haven't been abandoned." She began moving toward the jeep. "You get your robot deployed, map the devices. I'll coordinate the evacuation on foot." Lysenko caught her arm. "Lieutenant, if there are more mines, if there's an anti-personnel device we haven't detected, you'll be walking into..." "I know what I'll be walking into, Captain." She met his eyes. "But I also know what it looks like when a bridge full of families realizes no one's coming to help them." She'd seen it before. In Mariupol, in Bucha, in a dozen places whose names had become synonyms for tragedy. Not again, not today. The object Sophia approached the bridge on foot, hands raised, her military identification held high, so the civilians could see she wasn't a threat. The walk felt eternal, each step measured, careful, eyes scanning the surface for disturbances. Behind her, Lysenko's robot whirred to life, beginning its slow crawl along the bridge's shoulder. The civilians watched her approach with expressions that shifted between hope and suspicion. A man stepped forward, tall, tired-looking, with a border collie pressed against his legs. The dog's attention wasn't on her, though. It was fixed on something else, something further down the bridge. "I'm Lieutenant Marchenko," she called out, still approaching slowly. "Ukrainian army, we're aware of your situation. We're going to get you out." "There are mines," the man said, his voice rough. "2 that we know of, maybe more. We know. We're mapping them now. Once we have locations confirmed, we'll find a way to—" The dog barked, not at her, past her, toward the eastern end of the bridge where she'd just walked. Sophia felt ice slide down her spine. She turned slowly, following the dog's gaze, and saw nothing, just empty pavement. The same surface she'd walked across moments before. But the animal was rigid, focused, every line of his body screaming alert. "What is it?" she asked, though she was already dreading the answer. The man, Maxim, he'd said his name was Maxim, spoke quietly. "He's been right twice already. I'm not betting against him a third time." Sophia walked back, slower now, eyes scanning the ground. And there, 15 meters from where she'd entered the bridge, she saw it, a disturbance in the surface. Slight, barely visible. The kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking, unless something had pointed you toward it. A third mine. She'd walked over it. Her legs went weak. For several seconds she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the nearness of the death she'd just avoided. Then training kicked in, pushing the fear down into a box she could deal with later. She pulled a piece of chalk from her pocket, standard equipment for engineers, carried by soldiers who'd learned to mark danger, and drew a circle around the disturbed area. Then she backed away, rejoined the civilians, and allowed herself one long, shaky breath. "Your dog," she said to Maxim. "He just saved my life." "He seems to be making a habit of that today," Maxim replied, and Sophia heard the exhaustion in his voice, the sound of a man who'd used up all his fear and had nothing left but numb acceptance. She looked at the dog more carefully now. The matted fur, the intelligent eyes, the way he held himself with quiet alertness. And she noticed for the first time what was hanging from his collar, a small medallion worn and scratched with an engraving she couldn't quite read from this distance. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Maxim knelt, unclipping the medallion and holding it out. It was brass, old, about the size of a coin. The engraving showed a dog's silhouette and a single word in Ukrainian, Vernist, fidelity. "It belonged to my grandfather," Maxim said quietly. "He served in the Soviet army during Afghanistan, combat engineer. He had a dog, a German shepherd named Bars. They cleared mines together." His voice caught. "Bars died saving his unit, stepped on a device that would have killed 6 men. My grandfather never got over it, wore this medallion for 40 years. He looked at Hrom and something passed between man and dog, an understanding, perhaps, or the recognition of legacy. When Hrom was born, my grandfather was still alive. He saw him as a puppy, said he had the same eyes as Bars, made me promise to put the medallion on his collar." Maxim's hand tightened around the brass circle. "He said some dogs are born knowing things, born with purpose." Sophia stared at the medallion, at the dog, at the bridge mined with invisible death, and she understood that what was happening here was more than luck, more than training, more than simple animal instinct. This was legacy. This was bloodline. This was a dog fulfilling a destiny written decades before he was born. "We're going to get you all out," she said, voice firm. "I promise you that, but first, we need to make sure there are no more devices. And for that," she looked at Hrom, "I need to borrow your dog." The Walkley-Senko's robot had mapped 3 devices. The engineers needed confirmation on a 4th potential signature at the bridge's western terminus, where seismic sensors suggested recent excavation. But the robot's battery was dying, its camera glitching from cold, and the afternoon light was failing fast. Which was how Lieutenant Sophia Marchenko found herself walking the length of a mined bridge with a border collie she'd met 15 minutes ago, trusting her life to an animal's sense of smell and a dead man's medallion. "If this goes wrong," she muttered to Hrom, "your owner is going to have me court-martialed, assuming there's enough of me left to prosecute." The dog's tail wagged once, as if to say, "It won't go wrong." They moved slowly, Sophia keeping her weight balanced, her steps light. Hrom walked ahead, nose low, moving in a zigzag pattern that looked random but wasn't. It was a search grid, methodical and thorough, the kind of thing that came from instinct refined by breeding. Every few meters he'd stop, sniff deeply, then move on. Behind them the convoy watched in silence. Sophia could feel their eyes, their hope, their terror. One wrong step, one missed signal. That's all it would take. The wind picked up, carrying sleet that stung her face and made the bridge's surface slick. Visibility dropped. The western end of the bridge disappeared into grey haze, and for a moment, Sophia felt like she was walking into nothing, into erasure, into the kind of space where people vanished and were never found. Then Hrom stopped. His body went rigid, his ears flattened. A sound emerged from his chest, not a bark, not a growl, but something more ancient, more primal, the sound a wolf might make when cornering prey. Sophia froze mid-step, her boot hovering centimeters above the pavement. Slowly, carefully, she lowered it to the side, distributing her weight across the balls of her feet. "Show me," she whispered. Hrom pawed gently at a spot 3 meters ahead, not digging, just indicating. Sophia pulled out her chalk and marked it, then radioed back to Lysenko. "Confirmed. 4th device, western end 2 meters from the expansion joint." Lysenko's voice crackled back, heavy with something that might have been respect or might have been disbelief. "Copy that. Robot's reading matches the dog's position. That's 100% accuracy rate." "What's the spacing pattern?" Sophia asked, already doing the math in her head. "Irregular. Designed to look random, but there's logic to it. They placed them where weight distribution would be highest, where vehicles would naturally position themselves, where momentum would be hardest to stop. It's professional work. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Sophia looked back at the convoy, at the families huddled in cars, at the children's faces pressed to glass. Professional work. Which meant professionals were trying to kill them. Not soldiers in the heat of battle, not artillery fired blind at grid coordinates, but someone who had planned this, who had walked this bridge in daylight, who had calculated how to turn a lifeline into a death trap. The rage that flooded through her was clean and cold, sharpening her thoughts rather than clouding them. "Lysenko, I need options. We can't disarm them, not quickly enough. And we can't airlift 40 people off that bridge before dark. We don't have the helicopters, and even if we did, enemy AA would light them up the moment they approached." A pause. "But there might be another way." The maneuver. The plan was insane, improvised, and depended on tolerances measured in centimeters. But it was the only plan they had. The bridge had 2 lanes, each approximately 3 meters wide, with shoulders on either side. The mines were positioned in the driving lanes, placed where vehicle weight would naturally concentrate. But the shoulders, narrow, meant for emergency stops, were theoretically clear. If vehicles could navigate along the shoulders, staying precisely positioned, staying light enough not to shift the bridge's load-bearing in ways that might sympathetically trigger devices, it might work, or it might kill everyone. "I've done more complicated 3-point turns," said one of the drivers, an older man with hands that shook but a voice that remained steady. "In Kiev traffic during a snowstorm, drunk." He grinned, and the grin was equal parts humor and hysteria. This is just parallel parking with higher stakes." They began the maneuver 1 vehicle at a time. Lysenko walked each driver through the positioning, using laser sights to mark the exact path, keeping up a steady stream of calm instructions that felt like a lifeline. The first vehicle, a compact sedan, inched forward, tires straddling the shoulder line. The driver's face was bone white, eyes fixed forward, knuckles locked on the wheel. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. 15 meters, 20, 30. The sedan passed the first marked mine with a meter of clearance, then the second, the third. When it cleared the fourth, reaching the western end where Sophia and Lysenko waited, the driver stumbled out and vomited onto the roadside, then sat down hard on the ground and began to laugh, high and broken, the sound of a man who'd just looked death in the face and won by a coin toss. "Next," Sophia called, her voice carrying back across the bridge. One by one they came. The truck with the old man in the wool cap, the van full of grandmothers clutching icons, the station wagon with 4 children pressed into the back seat, each vehicle a held breath, each driver navigating the gauntlet with the kind of desperate precision that comes only from having no other choice. And through it all, Hrom walked the shoulder, pacing the vehicles, double-checking what the instruments had already confirmed, that the path was clear, that the way was safe, that the invisible death beneath them remained inert and untroubled. Maxim's car was last. The choice. He should have gone earlier, but he'd insisted on waiting, making sure every other family made it across first. Now, as the light failed and sleet turned to freezing rain, he sat behind the wheel with Darina beside him and Anya in the back, and he understood with crystal clarity that this was the moment where everything hung in balance. "We're going to be fine," he told his daughter, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Hrom showed us the way. Now we just follow it." Anya nodded, her small hand resting on the dog's head. Hrom sat beside her, calm now, his work complete, his purpose fulfilled. The medallion around his neck caught the last of the daylight, brass gleaming against dark fur. Maxim started forward. The world narrowed to the strip of pavement illuminated by Lysenko's laser sights, to the feel of the steering wheel under his hands, to the sound of his own breathing and the whisper of tires on wet concrete. He didn't look at the marked circles. He didn't think about the explosives beneath them. He thought only of the path, of the line, of moving forward, because backward was no longer possible. The first mine passed on his left, close enough that if he drifted 30 centimeters, the weight of the car would have compressed the trigger mechanism and ended everything. The second mine, the third. Ahead he could see Sophia waving him forward, see the other families gathered on safe ground, see the engineers with their equipment and their grim professional focus. Almost there, almost safe. And then Anya screamed. Not in fear, in confusion. Maxim's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror and saw his daughter pointing back toward the bridge, toward something moving on the roadway they'd just left. A figure, small, running, a child. The boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, stumbling along the bridge in the failing light, alone, terrified, calling out in a voice raw with tears. Later they'd learn his story, how he'd been riding in one of the early vehicles, how he'd needed to use the bathroom, how his mother had told him to wait just a few more minutes, how he'd opened the door anyway and climbed out while the convoy was stopped, had wandered behind the cars to relieve himself, and then the vehicles had started moving and he'd panicked, hidden, been left behind in the confusion. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a child was alone on a mined bridge, walking directly toward a marked circle, toward a device that wouldn't distinguish between intentional and accidental weight, between soldier and civilian, between threat and tragedy. Maxim stopped the car. Darina grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. "Don't, you can't, if you get out, if you add your weight." But Hrom was already moving. The dog launched himself from the back seat, squirming through the barely cracked window, before anyone could stop him, landing on the pavement with a scramble of claws and desperation. He ran, not toward the boy directly, but to intercept, to cut off the child's path before those small feet could take him into the kill zone. Sophia was shouting something over the radio. Lysenko was running back onto the bridge, but they were too far, moving too slow, and the boy was seconds from stepping on the device marked with chalk, the one Hrom had found, the one that waited with mechanical patience for sufficient pressure to complete its terrible purpose. Hrom reached the boy first. The dog hit him broadside, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to knock him sprawling, away from the marked spot, toward the shoulder where the pavement was clear and safe. The boy screamed, flailing, not understanding, thinking he was being attacked. And then Hrom kept moving, kept running, directly toward the mine. Later witnesses would argue about what happened next. Some said the dog was simply carried by momentum, unable to stop his forward motion. Others claimed they saw Hrom adjust his trajectory, deliberately positioning his body over the device as if he understood, impossible as it seemed, that his weight alone might not be enough to trigger it, that the pressure plate was calibrated for vehicle mass, not animal mass, and that by placing himself there, by claiming that space, he was preventing anyone else from making the fatal mistake. What no one argued about was what happened when Lysenko reached the spot, when he knelt beside the dog and examined the device with shaking hands, when he looked up with an expression that combined relief and horror and something close to religious awe. "The trigger's partially corroded," he said, his voice barely audible. "Another 50 kilograms of pressure and it would have gone. But the dog's weight isn't enough to complete the circuit. He's—" Lysenko stopped, shook his head, started again. "He's holding position over the device. If he moves, if weight shifts, the mechanism might still engage. But as long as he stays perfectly still." The dog was saving them again, not by alerting them to danger, but by becoming a living shield, by placing his body between death and the people he'd been born to protect. The final extraction. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Sophia's life. They brought cutting equipment, carbon fiber mat, a specialized platform that could distribute weight evenly enough to prevent trigger engagement. They worked in darkness now, under portable lights that cast harsh shadows and made every movement look threatening. Hrom didn't move, didn't whine, didn't struggle. He simply lay there, perfectly still, amber eyes watching the humans work, waiting with the patience of a creature who understood that his job wasn't finished yet. They slid the platform beneath him millimeter by millimeter, transferring his weight while maintaining constant pressure on the trigger mechanism. Then they added ballast, sandbags calculated to exactly match the dog's mass. And finally, carefully, Lysenko lifted Hrom free, cradling the animal in his arms and walking backward, one slow step at a time, until they reached the safe zone where Maxim waited with tears streaming down his face. The moment Hrom's paws touched safe ground, the dog's composure broke. He shook, whined, pressed himself against Maxim's legs with the desperate need for contact, for reassurance, for confirmation that his people were safe. "Good boy," Maxim whispered, his voice breaking. "Good boy, you did it, you saved everyone." The boy Hrom had knocked aside, the one who'd wandered onto the bridge, stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. His mother had appeared from one of the other vehicles, having only just realized her child was missing. She knelt, pulling the boy close, then looked at Hrom with an expression that held no words adequate to what she felt. "Thank you," she managed finally, the phrase insufficient but sincere. Darina approached Sophia, Anya clinging to her side. "What happens now?" "Now?" Sophia looked back at the bridge, at the marked circles that glowed in the harsh portable lighting, at the vehicles safely gathered on the western side. "Now we route everyone to temporary shelter. We get engineers working on proper mine clearance. It'll take days, maybe weeks. And we make sure everyone knows that this bridge is closed until further notice." She paused. "And we make sure everyone knows why you're all alive. The medal, the story, the legacy." 3 weeks later, in a ceremony held in a gymnasium converted into a refugee center, a Ukrainian general whose name would be forgotten but whose actions would be remembered pinned a medal to Hrom's collar. The medal for saving life. Rarely awarded to animals, but impossible to deny in this case. The press was there, cameras, journalists hungry for good news in a war defined by tragedy. They took photos of Hrom sitting calmly beside Anya, of the boy he'd saved reaching out to pet his head, of Maxim standing straight-backed and proud with his hand resting on the dog's neck. But what the cameras didn't capture, what couldn't be captured, was the moment after the ceremony when Lysenko approached Maxim privately and handed him something small and worn. The brass medallion, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, the one that read Fidelity. "This belongs with the other one," Lysenko said quietly, nodding toward the military decoration now hanging from Hrom's collar. "Legacy and service, past and present, he's earned both." That night, as Maxim's family settled into their temporary housing, a single room in a converted school, cramped but safe, Anya asked the question that had been building in her for weeks. "Papa, how did Hrom know? How did he know where the bad things were?" Maxim thought about it for a long moment, stroking the dog's head, feeling the animal's steady breathing, the warmth of fur against his palm. "I don't know, Malyush. Maybe dogs can smell things we can't. Maybe your great-grandfather's spirit guided him. Maybe—" He stopped, smiled. "Maybe some creatures are just born knowing how to protect the people they love." But later, lying awake while his family slept, Maxim understood something deeper. Hrom hadn't just detected explosives. He'd detected wrongness, the disruption of something that should have been safe, the presence of malice disguised as normalcy. He'd sensed the bridge the way it truly was, beneath the surface, beyond the lie. And in doing so, he'd taught them all a lesson about trust, about listening to warnings that didn't come in words, about believing in instincts even when logic said otherwise. The bridge today. The bridge remains closed. The mines have been cleared, the devices neutralized, the surface repaired. But people don't use it much anymore. They take the northern route, longer but less haunted by memory. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, if you stand at the bridge's eastern end, you can see them. Families making the crossing on foot, walking carefully along the shoulder, bringing flowers to place at the spots where the mines once waited. Memorials to luck, to fate, to a dog who understood what humans couldn't. And if you ask the locals about it, they'll tell you the story. Details will vary. Some versions make Hrom bigger, smarter, almost supernatural. Others focus on the human elements, the choices made under pressure. But all versions agree on the essential truth. A family tried to escape Ukraine. Their dog stopped them on a bridge, and in doing so, That dog saved not just his family, but 43 people, including 12 children, who would have died if a border collie named Thunder hadn't trusted his instincts more than human judgment, trusted convenience. For you who are listening, you might think this story is about war, about danger, about explosives, about the mechanics of escape and survival. But it's not. It's about listening. It's about the voices that speak to us in ways we don't expect, through animal behavior, through instinct, through the feeling in your gut that something is wrong, even when everything looks right. How many times have you ignored that feeling? How many times have you pushed forward because stopping seemed inconvenient, because turning back seemed like giving up, because admitting you don't know the path ahead felt like weakness? Fromm stopped because he didn't have the luxury of ignoring what he sensed. He didn't have pride to protect or schedules to keep, or the cognitive tools to rationalize away fear. He had only instinct, loyalty, and the unwavering certainty that his people were walking into danger, and he refused to let them continue. That's the lesson. Not heroism in the dramatic sense, not charging into battle or performing impossible feats, but the quiet, stubborn heroism of saying no, not this way, not today, not while I'm here to stop you. The next time something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why, even if everyone around you is moving forward with confidence, even if stopping seems foolish, stop anyway. Listen to the voice that doesn't use words. Trust the instinct that precedes logic. Honor the wisdom that lives deeper than thought. Because sometimes the only thing standing between you and disaster is the willingness to pause, to look closer, to question what you've been told is safe. Sometimes salvation wears fur and walks on four paws. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to take another step forward. And sometimes, often in fact, the creatures we think we're protecting are actually the ones protecting us.